Okay, so this video is part of our series on deploying a DataStax cluster to Azure, and it concentrates on next steps once you've deployed either via the marketplace or the CLI. So let's take a look at a couple things and get started. Exit out of PowerPoint, and then over here I have my terminal window for last time. One of the things you may have noticed is we were able to connect to the Ops Center machine without authenticating at all over the public internet. Clearly not the most secure thing in the world. So our normal recommended practice would be to connect up to that machine. So I SSH in and enter in my password. And on that machine, under etc Ops Center, we can see a file called opscenterd.conf. So let's take a look at that. In this file, there's some SSL configuration. There's also a setting for authentication, and you can see that's set to false. And that's the default setting to turn that off. For most deployments, we would recommend turning that on, as well as turning SSL on. To do that, you set authentication enabled equals true, and you would need to restart Ops Center. This is detailed in the documentation. Similarly, each of the nodes is publicly accessible via a public IP address associated with it. In Azure terminology, this is a dynamic public IP address. What dynamic means for Azure is that the IP address will stay with the machine for the lifetime of the machine as long as it is running and its resources remain reserved. Rebooting the machine, it will still retain its IP address. If the hardware fails, it will still retain its IP address. So that works for the vast majority of DataStax scenarios. Our database is designed to be always on, so we don't really tend to see customer use cases where they want to turn it off. Given that, dynamic public IP addresses usually work quite well as opposed to a static public IP address. However, some security around those is usually useful. DataStax can be configured to use SSL communication between nodes, and that's covered in the DataStax documentation. In Azure-specific environments, it usually makes sense to look at something called a network security group, sometimes referred to as an NSG. NSGs are basically Azure's kind of firewall. So best practices would involve firewalling off specific ports for public access. In some cases, it's useful to allow access so tools like DevCenter and CQL Shell can connect from developers' laptops. Similarly, in multi-data center deployments, we recommend using public IP addresses for that inter-data center communication, so it's necessary to allow that. One thing I should call out is if you're running a multi-DC cluster with all the nodes in Azure, all that communication will be routed over Azure's backbone, even over the public IP addresses. So what we typically recommend is to block off IP addresses that are not part of the cluster or part of client applications. So that's largely what we have for next steps. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to us and let us know if there are additional things we should include. Thanks.